In a hobby of tinkering that relies so heavily on customization, it's no surprise that we've seen a number of different modifications fall in and out of favour with the mainstream over the years. This time last year, everyone and their mums loved PE foam, and now this seems to be a thing of the past, with everyone and their mums complaining about flex cuts in PCBs. This got me thinking of the early years in the hobby, the mods prior to tape mod and foam, and the mods that were mainstream way back when the hobby was still in its infancy. So what modifications did people do? What mods were popular? Let's find out together. In a time before hot-swap PCBs existed, when we didn't have QMK or VIA, some of the first mods that people really explored were just, well, getting their damn keyboard open in the first place. I guess we take for granted being able to choose our own layouts with solder PCBs now. And even hot-swap PCBs often come with a number of different bottom row and caps lock options. Other mods described were fitting for times when CNC aluminium cases weren't the standard. Things like painting cases isn't something that's commonplace nowadays. When the choice of switch didn't go any further than Cherry MX, people would mod the switches by adding different weight springs, even posting tutorials of how to do this without the need to desolder the switches from the PCB. This is where a favoured Franken switch first came into existence, the Ergo Clear. A switch made by people combining the spring from a Cherry MX red or brown switch in the housing and the stem of an MX Clear switch to produce an equally tactile switch that was lighter under the fingers for longer periods of typing. Another variant also came to be around at this time, which was known as the Panda Clear. This was comprised of an MX Clear stem and a Cherry MX black spring, named after the geek hack user Panda R in 2011. Alongside the Ergo Clears, some of the first real modifications came to be in the early 2010s. If you scroll geek hack for long enough, you start to get a glimpse into the number of guides people made for modifying custom keyboards. And Desk Authority has a whole page on its wiki for it as well. Posts such as the modding cookbook from 2014 on geek hack highlight mods from some of the most basic, like opening up a board and pulling keycaps off, to modifications that are still heavily utilised in the keyboard metagame today. Mods like case dampening with foams or shelf liner, clipping stabilisers prior to the existence of Durox stabs, TX stabs or stabies, and switch films were seen to be done almost 10 years ago, which I for one find super interesting. One mod on this specific list which really caught my eye is the trampoline mod. This was a mod that, like most things, originated over on the Korean message boards. The first post I can find on this dates back to 2013, whereby geek hack user Oobly added a small piece of rubber trimmed from an O-ring into the bottom housing of a switch to limit the travel needed from actuation to bottom out. This was also done in order to produce a more cushioned feel under the fingers when typing. Although the modularity of this is cool in the sense you can decide the length of the rubber used and therefore how much you would like to alter the travel distance, it also seems very jarring to have to cut down like 80 pieces of rubber to the exact sizings you want. But what do I know, filming switches isn't exactly a walk in the park, right? A similar mod to this, which also dampened the bottom out but did not affect travel distance, was the dental floss mod. This was a mod that was primarily invented for the IBM beam spring boards, in order to minimise the ringing noise heard when compressing the switches that was later applied to MX style switches for a similar reason, but also dampened out that hard-hitting bottom out sound and feel. The mod involved placing a piece of dental floss down the centre of the spring in each of the switches. An interesting one with this is that it was also added to the leaf of the switch in order to reduce leaf ping. I don't really know what sounds more daunting, lubing every single leaf or inserting a piece of floss into each one. Actually, I take that back, floss is definitely the worst choice. Is this just a hobby for masochists? Maybe? Like with lubing switches, where too much will result in mushy feeling switches and isn't pleasant to type on at all, too much floss will have the same effect, leading to a very sluggish and mushy feeling bottom out. Alongside these were the more well-known O-ring mod that was a lot more common around 2015 and for a few years after, functioning in a similar way to the latter in terms of sound profile. Definitely the easiest one to install out of the 3A. It's funny to think that people wanted to do modifications to reduce the sound that their keyboard was making, whereas half the hobby nowadays revolves around the specific sound signature you can get out of your build. But I guess that might also have something to do with the fact we have a much wider choice of switches now, especially in terms of feel and tactility, that we aren't just limited to MX browns or clears, not to mention clicky switches that don't really exist in the ecosystem at all. Whereas back then, the tactile feeling that could be achieved was far more limited, and for the most part was the end goal in opting for a mechanical keyboard over the membrane options of the time. But we can't talk about push feel without discussing Topre, and more importantly, the supremacy that was Topre in the field of tactility. Or, well, still is, I guess, depending who you ask. Many mods were done around Topre boards and the domes themselves, as well as modifications that made MX style switches feel like typing on Topre domes. Aside from the obvious switching to aftermarket domes or various lubing methods, one of the earliest Topre mods seen, and one of the rarer mods throughout the keyboard forums, was done by cutting holes in the domes themselves in order to reduce the force needed for them to compress. I think this might be seen as a war crime nowadays. Although this was done, this isn't exactly something that was favoured by the masses, especially as it was an irreversible modification. This isn't a mod that there is a lot of information on, so if you know anything more about it, do let me know in the comments down below. A far more common modification talked about, which I find really interesting, goes by many names. This utilised domes pulled from specific old keyboards in order to get the feel of aftermarket Topre domes using MX switches. Posts are seen throughout 2018 and 2019, but the best one, giving the most in-depth rundown, was posted by Reddit user Enquiries. The mod made use of the spill-proof membrane and domes found on cop boards, which as the name suggests were used by the police, having a membrane and dome arrangement that cover the switches and PCB. The post by Enquiries describes the process of taking the dome sheet out of the donor board, trimming them down and placing them between your desired switches and keycaps. As the domes contribute to the force needed to actuate the switch, silent switches without springs were utilised in order to not have 90-gram switches across the board. The mod itself, as you can imagine, does have a few major drawbacks though, and this may be the reason why it isn't all across your timeline today. The first is that R1G and K keycaps bind with the domes, therefore only higher keycap profiles can be used, which aren't really favoured by the masses. The second is that the mod doesn't work for large stabilised keys, and so if you see this online, it will predominantly be on split ortho boards, ortho linear boards, or 40%, form factors that, once again, aren't favoured by the masses. This aside, although I myself have never tried the mod, having a push feel reminiscent of aftermarket Topre domes on an MX compatible keyboard seems pretty good to me, and all posts following the rundown provided by Enquiries give a pretty positive experience to doing the mod. Now, the last mod that I have on my list isn't so much for modification, but more so something that was uncommon for the time, and something that I think we take for granted in the software ecosystem that we have today, and that is everything to do with the Phantom 84 PCB. The Phantom 84 PCB was an aftermarket PCB that hit group buy on GeekHack in 2011. It was designed with a programmable controller to fit inside the Philco keyboard cases that were extremely popular in the West at the time. The PCBs and associated switch plates allowed for the use of 7 new bottom rows and step caps so that vintage Cherry double-shot keycap sets could be used on the Philco boards, without the need for finding replacement keys for these positions. The PCB also offered LED indicators for caps lock, scroll lock, and also offered both ANSI and ISO layouts as an option. I find it really interesting to think that custom PCBs were being designed way back when, and how PCBs like the Phantom 84 and the GH60 project are the reason we have a lot of the PCBs on the secondary market that we do today. Remember when I mentioned painting cases? The Phantom PCB also played a part in another popular modding trend at the time, on the Cooler Master QFR boards. These were based on the same CoStar prototype that was used for the Philco MJ2 at the time, but cost a fraction of the price. The guys over at Cooler Master were also invested in the enthusiast scene, offering QFR case tops for sale separately for experimentation and modification, as well as even partnered up with GeekHack for an anniversary competition in 2013. This allowed people to post their own customized QFR case tops to be in with a chance of winning prizes, and Cooler Master even provides a discount code for the case tops on their store for this. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, I think it's pretty cool to look back at some of the mods that were popular in the early days of the hobby. Hell, even the last few years where popularity of different mods allowed them to fall in and out of favour with the masses, comparable to other hobbies like fashion. I guess in a way, the keyboard hobby is very comparable to other hobbies where trends come and go, coming back in when a new generation discovers what the old dogs were doing way back when. The major difference with the keyboard hobby and the other factors added into all of this is how the keyboard hobby has really evolved in the last few years. All the new switches that seem to almost be a weekly occurrence at this point mean that the options we have now span far further than just Cherry. Although you wouldn't think this with the number of MX Black sound tests you hear, right? But this does mean that the hobby has had this major shift from being mostly about feel to being about both sound and feel. I guess what I'm really trying to say with all of this is that it's far easier today to get a board that sounds, looks, and feels exactly how you want it. And this also means that a lot more effort will need to go into changing the norm by finding something new. Think about all the new mounting styles we've seen over the past few years. Flex cuts in PCBs and layout options that have all aided in showing that there isn't a limited number of forms or configurations that a keyboard can take upon the desk. I love you, Alice layout. Now, that's all from me today. If you've enjoyed the video, do leave a like down below and subscribe if you aren't already. The road to 3K starts here, so all your help is appreciated. Any mods that I didn't mention that you would have done? Let me know down below. The Discord server is now live, so if you're interested in joining, click the link below in the description. Thanks for watching, and I will see you nerds in the next one. Peace. Bro, I am sweating.